A boot came down on a woman's wrist and ground it into the dirt. She didn't scream. A second man kicked a rusted rifle across the yard, laughing as it spun into a water trough. A third grabbed her by the hair and hauled her up to her knees. Blood ran from her lip. She spit it at his boots. He backhanded her across the jaw and she dropped again into the dust. Chickens scattered. A dog barked from behind a fence and got silence for it, a rock thrown hard enough to crack wood. The woman on the ground was Mercy Calloway. 61 years old. Widow. Alone on 40 acres these men wanted for nothing. What none of them bothered to ask was why a woman living alone kept a shovel by every door on her property. 9 of them, buried quiet, over 11 years. Stay with me on this one. The man with his boot on her wrist finally stepped back. He was younger than the other two, maybe 30, with a soft face that hadn't seen much sun. He looked down at Mercy like she was something he'd scraped off his boot heel. "Sign the paper," he said. "Judge Pratt don't like waiting." Mercy pulled her arm in against her ribs and worked her fingers. Nothing broken. She'd know. She'd set enough bones in her life to know the difference between pain and damage. "Judge Pratt can wait till the valley floods," she said. The second man laughed. He was the one who'd kicked her rifle into the trough, a barrel-chested man with a mustache gone gray at the edges. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her knee. "Old woman's got some fire left in her." 40 acres, the third one said. He was the one still holding a fistful of her hair, and he yanked it now for emphasis before he let go. 40 acres of scrub and rock. "Why fight us on it?" "Because it's mine," Mercy said. "Every foot of it." The soft-faced one crouched down so his eyes were level with hers. "Judge Aldous Pratt is putting a cattle route through this valley whether you sign or not. He's already got the Hendricks place. The Millers folded last month. You're the last stubborn patch of dirt between here and the river crossing." Mercy looked past him toward the road, toward town 4 miles off, where nobody was coming to help her because nobody ever did. Her nearest neighbor, a widower named Odell, could see her chimney smoke from his porch on a clear day. He never came around asking why she kept 2 shovels leaning against the well house and 1 more by the henhouse door. Nobody in that county asked Mercy Calloway much of anything. She'd buried 2 husbands on this land. First one, Abel Calloway, dead of a fever the winter after they married. Second one, a quiet man named Thomas Reyes who'd taken her name instead of the other way around, gone 3 years later in an accident nobody talked about much because there wasn't much to say. A wagon wheel. A steep grade. That was the story, and folks let it lie there same as they let her lie there, alone on 40 acres for 11 years, never remarrying, never leaving, never explaining herself to anybody who thought she owed them an explanation. The soft-faced man straightened up and nodded at the others. "Burn the fence line. Let her think on it." They didn't wait for her to argue further. 2 of them walked off toward the split-rail fence that ran along the north edge of her property, the one she'd rebuilt herself 3 summers back after a windstorm took half of it down. One man struck a match against his belt buckle. The dry wood caught fast, and within a minute the whole line was burning, orange and ugly against the afternoon sky, the smoke curling up thick enough that Odell would see it from his porch and do nothing about it, same as always. The soft-faced man crouched next to her one more time. "We'll be back at sundown," he said. "You sign the paper, or you don't. Either way the land's Pratt's by morning. Difference is whether you're still standing on it when it happens." He nodded toward the trough, where a rifle sat half-submerged, rust flaking off the barrel into the water. "Won't be needing that. Looks like it hasn't fired in a decade." The 3 of them laughed at that, genuinely amused, and mounted up without hurry. They rode off toward the road at an easy walk, not even bothering to look back, because why would they? An old widow on her knees in the dirt, fence burning behind her, rifle ruined in a trough. Nothing here to worry about. Mercy stayed on her knees until the sound of hoofs faded. Then she stood. Slow, but steady. She checked her wrist again, rolling it once, twice, satisfied it would hold. She looked up at the sun. Maybe 4 hours till sundown. Plenty of time. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in a long while, not since the second funeral, and even then it hadn't lasted. She walked past the burning fence without stopping to look at it, past the trough where a rifle sat rusted and useless, straight to the barn. Inside, she moved to the far corner, knelt down, and pried up a loose floorboard with her bare fingers. Underneath sat a ledger book, leather cover gone soft with age. She opened it. Names. Dates. Small marks beside each one, neat little X's, 9 of them in her own careful hand. She closed the book and sat there a moment in the dark of the barn, thinking. Mercy put the ledger back under the floorboard and pressed it down flat. She brushed the dirt from her knees and walked to the house, changed into a clean dress, and hitched her mule to the wagon. Her wrist ached with every pull on the reins, but she didn't slow down. For miles to town, and she meant to use every minute of daylight she had left. The marshal's office sat between the feed store and the bank, a squat building with a star painted on the door, half worn off from years of hands pushing through. Marshal Dutton was a heavy-set man who kept his boots up on his desk more often than not, and today was no exception. He looked up when Mercy walked in, took one look at her split lip and the bruise coming purple along her jaw, and set his coffee down like it was suddenly too much trouble to hold. Mrs. Calloway. 3 men came onto my property this morning, Mercy said. Held me down, struck me, burned my fence line. They work for Judge Pratt. Dutton rubbed his face with one hand. You sure it was Pratt's men? They said his name themselves. Told me he wanted my signature by sundown. The marshal stood, walked to the window, looked out at nothing in particular. Judge Pratt owns most of the paper on this county now, Mrs. Calloway. Bank. Feed store. Half the ranches between here and the river. I can write up a report, but I can't tell you what a judge does with 3 men who work for him and no witnesses but you. I'm a witness. You're a widow with a grudge, is how a courtroom's gonna hear it. He said it gently, like the gentleness made it kinder. My advice, and I mean this as a friend, just sign the papers. Take whatever he offers. 40 acres of scrub isn't worth what it's gonna cost you to hold onto it. Mercy looked at him a long moment. Then she turned and walked out without another word. There was nothing left to say to a man who'd already decided which side he was standing on. She drove home with the sun dropping lower, the ache in her jaw keeping time with the wagon wheels. When she reached the house, she didn't go inside. She walked straight to the well house, knelt in the dirt behind it, and began digging with her hands until her fingers found the edge of a strongbox buried 18 inches down. She hauled it up, broke the rusted lock with a hatchet, and opened it right there in the dirt. Inside sat a roll of bills, more money than most folks in that county saw in a year. Beneath it, a second deed, older than the one Pratt's men wanted her to sign, folded in oilcloth to keep the damp out. And beneath that, a letter in handwriting she hadn't seen in years, Abel's handwriting, dated the year before he died. She read it twice. It named Abel Calloway as sole owner of the spring at the north end of the property, the one that fed the creek that fed every well and trough for 6 miles in either direction. Not the 40 acres Pratt's men had been hollering about. The spring. Pratt didn't want her land because it was good grazing. He wanted it because whoever owned that spring owned the water rights to half the valley, and every rancher downstream would pay whatever he asked to keep their cattle drinking. Mercy folded the letter back into the oilcloth and sat there in the dirt a long moment, the strongbox open beside her, the sun dropping toward the hills. She didn't hear the horses until they were nearly on top of her. 3 riders came up the road at a gallop, hours before sundown, and even at a distance she could tell they'd been drinking. They pulled up hard in front of the house, dust rolling out around the horses' legs, and the soft-faced one slid down first, unsteady on his feet. Changed our minds, he called out. Figured we'd just burn the barn now and save everybody the trouble of waiting. Mercy stood, closed the strongbox with her boot, and walked toward them carrying a lantern she'd lit against the coming dark. Her hands were steady. She stopped a few feet from the men and held the lantern up so the light caught all three of their faces. "You should leave," she said. "Now, while you still can." The mustached one laughed, the same laugh from that morning, and swayed a little in his saddle. "Old woman's threatening us now." Mercy didn't answer that. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded paper, one she'd written herself hours before, sitting alone in the barn with the ledger open beside her for reference. She held it out toward the soft-faced man, her hand trembling just enough to look real. "It's over," she said. "I'll sign. Just leave my well alone. Leave the house standing." He took the paper, unfolded it, squinted at it in the fading light, and grunted with satisfaction. "Smart woman. Should have done this hours ago and saved us all the trouble." "Take some water before you ride," Mercy said, nodding toward the well. "Long ride back to the Pratt place. No sense going dry." The mustached man filled a canteen from her well without a second thought, took a long drink, passed it to the others. They laughed among themselves, already talking about how the old woman had finally cracked, how easy it had been in the end, how Pratt would be pleased. They mounted up and rode off toward the road, canteen passing hand to hand, none of them looking back at the woman standing in her yard with a lantern. Mercy watched until the dust settled and the sound of hoofs faded into the evening. Then she walked to the porch, sat down on the step, and let out a long breath. She wet a cloth from the water bucket beside her and dabbed at the blood dried on her lip, careful, unhurried. The sun sat low over the western hills, painting the sky the color of a healing bruise. For the first time all day, something in her shoulders eased. The land was safe. The threat had ridden off down the road, satisfied, believing they'd won. One of the three riders doubled over in his saddle a half-mile down the road, and vomited so hard he nearly went over the side of his horse. The mustached man. He clutched his stomach, gasped something nobody understood, and then a second man, the one who'd yanked her hair that morning, pitched sideways off his horse and hit the dirt hard, his body already shaking. The soft-faced one pulled up hard, staring down at his two friends writhing in the road. What in the hell? He looked back the way they'd come, back toward the house, back toward the well, and something cold went through him that had nothing to do with the night air. This had never been a scared old woman signing away her land. This had been planned. Every step of it. The signature. The invitation to drink. All of it laid out like a trap sprung slow enough that nobody felt the jaws close until they were already inside. Mercy heard the commotion from her porch step, faint on the wind, and she didn't move. She sat with the wet cloth still in her hand, watching the last color drain out of the sky, and for a moment she let herself believe the night might actually end quiet. But this wasn't the end of anything. This was where the story turned into something else entirely. Because the two men choking in the dirt weren't just hired hands. They were Judge Pratt's own blood. Cousins, both of them, sons of his late brother, brought into the valley 6 months back to help him finish what the money and the paper couldn't. Pratt had built half his cattle route on the backs of men like that, men who shared his name and his temper and, now, whatever she'd put in that well water. If they died on her land, this stopped being a dispute over 40 acres. It stopped being pride, or stubbornness, or an old widow refusing to sign a piece of paper. It became a war. A war with the men who owned the bank, the feed store, and the marshal's polite indifference. A man who would bring every gun he had once he learned his own family had died drinking from Mercy Calloway's well. The soft-faced man understood this faster than his friends could have, had they been able to think straight through whatever was tearing through their bodies. He looked at them one more time, twisting in the dirt, and made a decision that would have surprised nobody who'd worked with him before. He turned his horse back toward the road they'd just come from and left them there. Not to fetch help. Not out of loyalty. He rode back toward Mercy's house alone, and by the time he reached the fence line, his pistol was already drawn. This wasn't about Pratt's orders anymore. This wasn't about a signature or a deadline or a valley full of cattle routes. This was personal now, the kind of personal that only comes from watching two men you rode with fall apart in the road behind you, and understanding, all at once, exactly whose hand had done it. Mercy heard the hoofbeats coming back fast and stood up from the porch step. She dropped the wet cloth into the bucket and looked toward the road, where a single rider was closing the distance at a dead run. She didn't panic. She'd had a lifetime of practice not panicking. She went inside, bolted the door behind her, and moved through the dark house with the ease of someone who'd walked these same rooms for 11 years without needing a lamp to find her way. She pulled the curtains closed over the front window. She dragged the heavy oak table across the floor and set it against the door, not because she thought it would hold forever, but because it would hold long enough. Then she went to the back room, knelt by the woodpile stacked against the wall, and reached behind the logs until her fingers found the stock of an old shotgun, wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp off. She unwrapped it slow, checked the barrels, broke it open to confirm both chambers loaded. Her hands didn't shake. Not once. This was not new to her, and anyone watching her in that moment would have understood, without being told, that Mercy Calloway had done this before. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button, because what she did next is the part nobody in that county ever talked about out loud. Outside, the soft-faced man reached the yard and swung down off his horse before it had even come to a full stop. He stumbled once, caught his balance, and started toward the house with his pistol raised, shouting her name into the dark. Calloway. Open this door. No answer came from inside. You poisoned them. You poisoned Pratt's own kin, you crazy old witch, and you're gonna answer for it right now. Still nothing. Just the sound of the wind moving through what was left of the burned fence line, and somewhere far off, the low murmur of a rider pushing his horse hard down the valley road, headed for the Pratt ranch to spread the word that something had gone terribly wrong at the widow Calloway's place. By morning, this would not be 3 men against 1 woman anymore. It would be a rider reaching the ranch gates before sunrise, Pratt himself pulling on his boots in the dark, calling for every gun he had on the payroll. It would be a posse forming in the gray light, a dozen men or more, all of them riding toward 40 acres of scrub ground that suddenly mattered a great deal more than anyone outside that valley would ever understand. And later, when men came through that yard searching for answers, they would find a canteen lying in the dirt near where the 2 cousins had fallen, Pratt's own initials carved crude into the metal, tying his family to the men who'd beaten a widow bloody in her own yard in broad daylight. But that was still hours away. Right now, there was only a locked door, a man with a gun standing outside it, and a woman inside with steady hands and a shotgun that had waited a long time for a night exactly like this one. The pounding came again, harder this time, boot heel against wood instead of a fist. Mercy stood in the dark hallway with the shotgun broken open across her forearm, listening to him work himself up on the other side of that door. I know you're in there, he shouted. I know what you did. She didn't answer. She'd learned a long time ago that silence did more work than words ever could. Scared men filled silence with their own worst fears. Let him fill it. He backed off the porch and circled the house, boots crunching over dry grass, trying the shuttered windows one by one. Mercy tracked him by sound alone, moving room to room to stay across from him. The shotgun snapped shut now, both barrels loaded, her thumb resting easy near the hammers. He came around to the back, where the woodpile sat stacked against the wall, and rattled the door there too. Locked, same as the front. He swore, loud enough for her to hear through the wood, and then his voice dropped into something quieter, something meaner. You buried 2 husbands out here, he said. Everybody in town always wondered how a woman managed that land alone for 11 years. Guess we know now, don't we? Mercy's jaw tightened, but her hands stayed steady. Come on out, he said. Or I swear I'll burn this house down around you same as I burned your fence. That was the mistake. Not the threat itself, but the confidence behind it. He thought he was dealing with a frightened old woman cornered in her own home. He had no idea he was standing on ground that had swallowed 9 men before him and never once given up their names. Mercy walked to the back door, slid the bolt, and stepped out into the yard before he could strike a match. He spun toward her, pistol coming up fast, and for a moment the 2 of them just stood there in the dark, 10 feet apart, lantern light spilling weak and yellow from the open door behind her. "Drop it," he said, meaning the shotgun she held loose across her body. "You first," Mercy said. He laughed, short and ugly. "You're an old woman with a busted lip holding a bird gun. I got a pistol and I got a reason. Pratt's own cousins are dying in the road because of you." "They're dying because they drank water they weren't invited to drink," Mercy said. "I told your friends to leave my well alone. They didn't listen. That's not murder. That's manners. Don't matter what you call it. It's blood on your hands now, same as everything else out here." He took a step closer, pistol steady, close enough now that the lantern light caught the sweat on his face. "How many is it really? Folks in town say things. Say you've got a garden that never needs turning because you already turned it plenty." Mercy's face didn't change. "9, she said, plain as reading off a grocery list. "You'll be the 10th if you take one more step." For a heartbeat, something flickered behind his eyes. Doubt. The kind that comes too late to save a man, but comes anyway. He took the step. Mercy raised the shotgun and fired the right barrel before he'd finished bringing his own weapon level. The blast caught him high in the shoulder and spun him sideways into the dirt, his pistol firing wild into the porch post as he fell. He hit the ground hard and didn't get up right away, gasping, clutching at the wound, blood already soaking dark through his shirt. She walked toward him slow, shotgun still raised, and looked down at him same as she'd looked down at the ledger in the barn that morning. Not with hatred. With something closer to arithmetic. "You should have listened when I said leave," she said. He glared up at her through the pane, teeth gritted. "You're gonna hang for this. Pratt's gonna see you hang." "Maybe," Mercy said. "But you won't be around to watch it." She didn't fire the second barrel. She didn't need to. The wound had done its work, and the man was in no shape to ride, let alone fight. She stepped past him, picked up his fallen pistol from the dirt, and emptied the cylinder into her apron pocket so he'd have nothing left to reach for. Then she went back into the house, set the shotgun on the table, and returned a moment later with rope from the barn. She bound his good arm to a fence post near the trough, tight enough to hold, loose enough that he wouldn't lose the limb before morning. He cursed at her the whole time, weaker with every breath, the fight draining out of him along with the blood. "Why?" he finally asked, quieter now. "Why not just sign like we asked? None of this had to happen." Mercy straightened up and looked out toward the road, toward the direction his two friends had ridden off in, toward the direction more riders would come from once word reached the Pratt ranch. "Because your judge doesn't want my land," she said. "He wants my spring. And a woman doesn't bury 9 men protecting 40 acres of scrub. She buries them protecting the one thing worth protecting." She left him tied there in the dark, went back inside, and sat down at her table with the ledger open in front of her by lamplight. She uncapped a small bottle of ink, dipped her pen, and beneath the 9th name, beneath the 9th small x, she wrote a 10th. Not finished yet. Not dead. But marked all the same, in the same careful hand that had marked every name before him, a hand that had never once shaken while doing it. Outside, far down the valley road, a rider pushed his horse hard through the dark toward the Pratt Ranch gates, carrying news that would bring a dozen armed men down on Mercy Calloway's 40 acres before the sun came up again. Dawn came up gray over the valley, and with it came the riders. Mercy heard them before she saw them, a dozen horses at least, moving fast down the road from the direction of the Pratt Ranch. She didn't run. She didn't hide the shotgun or the ledger or the man tied to the fence post, still alive, still cursing under his breath every few minutes. She walked out onto her porch and waited, same as she'd waited for plenty of things in her life that most folks would have run from. Judge Aldous Pratt rode at the front of them, an older man with a hard face and a coat too fine for the dirt he was riding through. He pulled up short at the sight of his cousin tied to the fence, bloodied and pale, and then at the sight of the 2 other men laid out on wagon boards behind the riders, covered with blankets that didn't quite cover their boots. He looked at Mercy a long moment. "You poisoned my family," he said. "I offered your men water," Mercy said. What they did with the invitation was their own choosing. Pratt's jaw worked, but he didn't dismount. Behind him, a dozen armed riders sat their horses, waiting on a word from him that would decide how this morning ended. Mercy could feel it in the air, the way a storm feels before the first drop falls. "I could burn this place to the ground right now," Pratt said. "Nobody in this county would stop me." "Maybe not," Mercy said. "But you'd be burning down the one thing keeping your cattle route alive." She held up the letter, the one she dug out from behind the well house, Abel's handwriting plain across the page even from a distance. "This name's my first husband, the owner of the spring at the north end of my property. Not the 40 acres your men came to steal. The spring. The one that feeds every well and trough for 6 miles downstream, including, I expect, a good number on your own land." Pratt didn't move, but something behind his eyes shifted, the same way it had in his cousin's the night before, right before the man made his final mistake. "You poisoned the spring," Mercy said, "same as your men poisoned themselves trying to steal it, and you'll ruin half this valley along with me. Ranchers who've never done you wrong. Men who vote, and talk, and remember things a long time after a judge's word stops mattering." She let that sit a moment. "Or," she said, "you ride out of here, call off whatever else you had planned, and we let the marshal sort out what happened to your kin honestly, with witnesses, with a ledger of dates that'll show exactly who came onto my land first and why." Pratt looked at the ledger in her other hand, the leather cover worn soft with age, and though he couldn't have known what was written inside it, something about the calm way she held it made him not want to find out. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then Pratt turned his horse, said something low to the men behind him, and the whole group wheeled around and rode back the way they'd come, taking the wounded men and the 2 covered bodies with them. Nobody looked back at the house. Nobody had to. The valley had already decided which of them it belonged to, even if it took the rest of that year for the paperwork to catch up. Marshal Dutton rode out 3 days later, alone this time, and sat on Mercy's porch step drinking coffee she'd made him, more polite than he'd been in his own office. "Judge Pratt's dropped his claim on your land," he said. "Word is he's leaving the county altogether, going east where nobody knows his name yet." "Good," Mercy said. Dutton turned his hat over in his hands. "Folks are asking questions again. About the shovels. About 11 years alone out here." Mercy looked out over her fence line, rebuilt now, the burn marks sanded clean off the new rails. "Let them ask," she said. "Asking's not the same as knowing." Dutton didn't push it. He finished his coffee, thanked her, and rode off without another word, and that was the last time anyone in an official capacity ever came looking for answers on Mercy Calloway's land. She lived another 19 years on those 40 acres, spring included, water rights included, and never once needed to dig a 10th hole. The ledger stayed under the barn floor until the day she died, and whoever found it after, family or stranger, never spoke of what they saw inside it, not in any way that made it back to town. Folks who drove past her property in later years sometimes noticed an old rifle still resting in the trough out front, rusted clean through, left there on purpose long after the men who'd thrown it there had stopped mattering to anyone. She kept it that way, she told a neighbor once, as a reminder. Not of what she'd survived. Of what she'd built after. She never remarried a third time. She never needed to. She'd already learned the only lesson worth keeping, the one that got her through 11 years alone and one very long night in particular. Some women don't need saving. They just need enough time, and enough water, to finish what other men started.